Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 66, Demystifying Non-Human Identity Management. Our guest today is Ryan Bradley, head of product at Natoma, and our co-host is Carl McGinnis, ex-Okta chief product architect and Natoma advisor. Welcome, guys.
Welcome. Hey.
Hey, great to be here.
So before we dive into the episode, we like to just ask the guests to share a little bit about their background. Ryan, why don't we start with you? How did you land as a head of product at an identity startup?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I've been working in identity for about 6 years now. Before that, I worked in software engineering as well as a few other different careers. Never really found something that stuck for me. And then actually found my way into identity, first working in product management at Okta, and that's where I was introduced to Carl, and I've had a great time working with him on Okta's various identity management products, including lifecycle management and identity governance. And about 6 months ago now, left Okta to join a few former colleagues at Natoma because I saw this burgeoning problem of non-human identity management and seemed like a very important problem and very urgent problem to tackle for organizations today, and thought it was the right group of people to join.
Nice. And Carl, I guess we met about 11 years ago. I remember meeting you at an Okta tequila tasting event at Gartner or something. But tell us a little bit about your storied background at Okta and how you got here.
I go way back. I've been doing identity stuff for over 25 years. Started off doing a lot of the early client server directory deployments, Novell, 10T, and Active Directory back in the early 2000s. Moved into a development role, did engineering and product engineering, and built identity providers in healthcare. And then as the cloud hit, I saw the need to sort of up level and sort of move identity from on-prem to cloud, and Okta was a great choice, and became an early employee at Okta when we only had a few customers, and was the first product hire there, and helped grow Okta from its early days as a small startup to the large company it is today. Built and led development of most of Okta's products, and led identity standards at Okta. Led a bit of and helped with a little bit of the M&A and a bit of the investment side. So was exposed to all aspects of the business, and helped drive the product forward. And recently left Okta earlier this summer, and enjoying a much deserved time off.
Nice. So let's dive into the topic. Non-human identity, NHI. It's a little strange to define something by what it's not. And I'm guessing Natoma is also non-Gorn identity and non-pigeon identity. What are non-human identities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. Something we hear a lot about when I talk to, especially friends and family that don't have as much experience with identity. They're like, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about pets or something like that. Really, I like to think about, I think non-human identity management is the right title for it, because there is this other space of human identity management where you're managing who has access to critical resources, and that the who being people who can actually log in and interact and have a little bit of more human behavior, or there is a person at the end of the day. So thinking employee access, customer access, partner access, that is really well solved by companies like Okta and has very mature products in place. But we see this really broad set of other actors within technology that doesn't have the same maturity of standards or the same maturity of processes around it, whether that's workloads, machine identities, service accounts, secrets and certificates. As you get into software development, the identities that power CI/CD pipelines, and as we start to enter the age of enterprise AI adoption, also everything that is powering AI agents, that's going to require some sort of other identity that isn't really managed by traditional, managed effectively by traditional identity products. So that's why non-human identity in my mind.
Okay. I'll continue hassling you about this, but we'll just move on. Maybe quickly before I go to Carl, I could just ask you, what's the impact of breaches in this area compared to, because I know identity is a really big attack surface area, human identity. What's the attack surface area of non-human identity?
So non-human identity is a huge attack surface area, especially when someone gets into an organization, they're looking to move laterally for a few reasons. A big ones from my point of view are the lack of visibility into non-human identities, the lack of control around non-human identities, and the broad access that non-human identities have. When it comes to lack of visibility, non-human identities get created and sort of forgotten about, especially as you have turnover within an organization. So people just don't necessarily know what exists. They also don't necessarily have the same security controls around them that they've placed around their human identities, and they've often granted them higher levels of access or broader access than any human identities. Because when you think about a non-human identity that connects two systems, you don't want that to be tightly scoped. You want that connection to empower everything. And that's why I believe there's a study earlier this year that showed non-human identities as being involved in 85% of recent breaches. So I view this as, even if it's not always the way in the door, it's often the way that an attacker moves laterally within an organization and increases the impact that they can have.
I see. So Carl, when you were at Okta, did you see customers struggling to manage non-human identities? And I'm wondering, did you ever see companies maybe create a human identity, which was actually for a non-human?
Yeah, so I think sort of building off what Ryan was talking about is lateral attack and decentralization of everything from processes and systems and identity stores. There wasn't really a fundamental, like there wasn't like an IDP for non-human identity that kind of grew up in the last 15 years. What we did is we grafted our existing human identity IDP models and token models and made it work for scenarios where it maybe shouldn't have. And so we built a lot of debt out there and a lot of sort of problems that we're now kind of catching up. And so what I saw at Okta was both internally at Okta, because Okta ran a SaaS. It had a lot of high profile attacks and breaches in the last couple of years, and a lot of deep diving in sort of root cause analysis and really looking at usage models and how customers needed to manage a full life cycle of a SaaS, whether that's through automation tools, whether it's CI/CD, whether that's from administrators just trying to do automated work to connecting test environments to production environments. You start seeing, as you start pulling on that thread, just how complex the stitching together everything becomes, and all these sort of static authorized tokens and credentials that are laying around that don't have centralized visibility, as Ryan was saying. And so we saw it with customers using Okta's products, as well as managing hundreds of and potentially thousands of other applications and SaaSes out there. And some of these SaaS products are large ecosystems in and of themselves. Like you think of something like Office 365, it's tightly coupled with Entra, which then becomes an IDP for a whole series of Azure and other bunch of outcomes, and trying to untangle that sort of nested relationships of access and indirection between the enterprise and the local account models and how those all map through becomes a big impedance mismatch between the way the world is and the way the world customers think it works. So I saw a lot of that, and legacy PAM products that have been deployed in the enterprise really came from focusing on a subset of that problem statement, and really was really driven from high compliance and high regulatory kind of requirements, and really didn't fit the shift to cloud native and cloud development and CI/CD and the ability for self-service and being integrated natively into the tool chains of what people are using today. Created this fragmentation of sort of, I have this legacy sort of tool that doesn't necessarily meet me where I'm at. I have a need to sort of deploy secrets and credentials and environment variables. Those environment variables are exposed on platforms. An attacker gets, into a platform, can start leaking environment variables, starts getting bearer tokens, able to send those bearer tokens, laterally attack them to another system. And that's kind of why we're seeing this problem statement in such a high sensitive or high demand today, is just how prevalent all these secrets from a lateral attack perspective are laying around and being able to be kind of cobbled together into some really interesting attack chains.
I'm going to put a pin in the privilege access management. Yep. But Ryan, I wanted to ask you about maybe similarities and differences between how an enterprise might approach managing human identities versus non-human identities. Are there things we can reuse, and what are the important differences there that we need to consider?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of principles that we can reuse and we're not reusing to the same extent. And a lot of those principles, in my mind, come to the core zero trust principles, especially around minimizing access in size and minimizing access in time. A lot of what I've seen when I speak to organizations about non-human identity is that these non-human identities that they need often get viewed as sort of a barrier to organizational velocity and organizational efficiency. So sort of becomes a situation where, all right, let's create something, let's give it permissions that we know will make it work, and let's forget about it. They don't actually take the same principles that they're trying to apply to their human identities around making sure that things only have access to the permissions that they need, and people only have access for the time that they require it, and apply those to non-human identities. And what I mean by that is the non-human identity isn't required anymore, then it should be retired. You shouldn't have that API token floating around that hasn't been used in the last 10 years or hasn't been meaningfully used in the last 10 years. And at the same time, you shouldn't just give every non-human identity the highest, most privileged level of admin permissions within any given system, which we also see from organizations because, as an admin, sometimes they don't have the full understanding of, I'm creating this non-human identity and maybe it might inherit all of my permissions. So I think those are two great examples of best practices that we see from human identity management that we could bring over to non-human identity management.
I see. And Carl, one of the things I hear people talking about is sort of the normal process for how humans get onboarded. So you get hired, you get more or less privileges over time, and then you leave the organization. And does that model, or what challenges would you say managing non-human identities raises because they don't really follow that same life cycle that we've built some of these other systems around?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a key aspect, which is the sort of joiner, mover, leaver lifecycle model for human identity. Is something that is sort of well known in deployments and best practices of sort of mature IAM deployments for human identity. And you have a central source of truth for who is an active employee, which is usually an HR system that is the business is using to manage that state. And then you can integrate around that to try to drive state changes and lifecycle changes and build business processes around that and handle change management. With non-human identities, this is where the fragmentation I mentioned exists, right? Which is you have ephemeral infrastructure being spun up in Amazon IAM. You have delegation across teams because you want teams to be productive. You don't want to necessarily have a central authority approving every single resource being spun up or used in the enterprise. You have teams and data scientists and folks that are getting access to data, and everyone needing automated programmatic access to wraps and resources in a way that you traditionally didn't need to before. And every one of these things, you can't just stop the business by shutting it down and having one approver for everything and try to manage it all. And no one team owns the sort of database of all these different resources and usages and life cycles. So that's where we're starting to see awareness of the problem statement of like, where can we start, whether, for example, in the DevOps model, where can we start leveraging, for example, AWS metadata and other CI/CD systems and GitHub and YAML files and lots of other, configuration driven models to try to start sourcing some of this data into your identity models, and then being able to dynamically grant credentials based on the evidence of the runtimes. and then have that flow through into access models to determine which identities and which principals then should get access, and have central replication of those types of models, instead of just sort of having each person sort of just issue their own types of credentials, trying to move to more of those federated type architectures that have trust and brokering of trust. Places where you can understand where trust models exist and broker across trust models. You start seeing protocols like Acme with certificate management start becoming much more common to start automating lifecycle, automating renewals, getting to that just-in-time type credentials that Ryan was mentioning about. I think that's where we're starting to see adoption, is sort of whether it's within certain teams inside the organization, or we're starting to see it in tool chains that security tools and security organizations are starting to start pushing to start getting governance around some of those processes in a more self-service kind of way.
Ryan, so Carl's mentioning some really part of an ideal state of where we want to get in terms of dynamically provisioning. But I like the white paper that you shared as part of the homework, which talks about where enterprises are today, because there's really a range. And it was also mercifully short, which is great for me, who reads a lot, has to read a lot of these things quickly to prepare. But can you talk a little bit about that life cycle? I think you just you described basically 5 different levels, 0 through 4, and talk about the range of where people are, where enterprises are today, and where they should be heading.
Yeah. So that maturity model that you're referring to, Mike, really starts from kind of that 0. We're not really doing anything. It's the complete Wild West, to much more of a more robust, complex model that I think Carl was referring to here, around more ephemeral connections between systems. And I think that is the gold standard and what we are moving towards as an industry. But it's going to take some time to get there, and it takes a lot of investment from an organizational perspective to get there. So that's where we laid out, I think there's a lot of intermediate steps that you can take along the way, and it pertains to the security of different credentials that you're using associated with non-human identities. We hope to see fewer and fewer people using just username and password based authentication associated with a non-human identity, as well as the lifetime associated with those credentials. How long they're actually allowing credentials to exist before they are rotated, and looking into what I mentioned there, the permissions, and ensuring that we have right-sized permissions, and that you're not granting more permissions than any given non-human identity really is going to take advantage of, because if you do, that represents another threat alongside your organization. If someone is to gain access to that non-human identity, I think there's also a key part around our organizational priorities there too, which is that, the risk associated with no two non-human identities are created equal. What might be powering my CI/CD pipeline might have access to a lot more information than something that's just powering a basic automation within my organization. So understanding where your key risks are and what has access to the most critical data, and targeting those first as you're looking to better secure non-human identities, I think is a great approach for an organization to take to get the biggest bang for their buck out of non-human identity management, and out of improving their organizational security posture. There's also a piece I wanted to add on to something Carl said, which there is sort of this human element of it, or this organizational stochasticity element of it, that's important to call out as well. And it came from one of our co-founders, who at a previous startup he was working at, he realized that they had some customers who had churned, but had given them admin access to various SaaS tools that they used. And despite them churning and not getting any revenue from these customers anymore, they still had the same level of administrator permissions within all those SaaS tools that former customers had integrated. So that's really the kind of simple example that I like to call out, to remember that oftentimes some of the biggest challenges come when the right hand doesn't talk to the left. And we think that the simple decision of not using a product anymore is just not paying the bill and canceling that subscription, but it is really a more involved process to ensure that you actually wind down your use of a given technology, and you don't expose yourself to risk for something that is a software you haven't used in 5 years.
So you're saying basically that they provide that a customer, an enterprise might have given credentials to a SaaS, but then never revoked those credentials. So
Exactly.
potentially, if the SaaS didn't expunge them, they might still be active, um,
Yep.
or they might not have rotated them properly. So it's a bad use. Um, I want to dive a little more into the weeds. We've been talking very, very high level. So, Carl, I'm putting you on the spot now. It sounds to me like there's a trust problem here, and it's both a tools and a rules challenge for organizations. Um, it sounds like what you're saying, Ryan, is that we need better tooling to address some of these challenges. But I want to turn to the other area, and I'm wondering, my question for you, Carl, is about, do organizations need to evolve how they manage these trust relationships with other organizations, which result in these client credentials or these non-human identities being issued? I'm just wondering, is like, do we need more maturity
Yeah,
in formalization and how organizations actually establish trust
I mean,
legally?
it's I think coming back to sort of these root problem statements is just, many different teams inside of an organization are, whether it's your marketing organization that's starting to collaborate with another external organization, right? So these B2B type problem statements, or even within any organization, you have different business units or different teams. The governance challenges are there, which is how do I define the process? How do I make sure that the entry points in the process, so that when somebody can do a self-service request to say, I want to onboard something, so you can start giving it identity, you start managing that lifecycle and tracking it. You can start getting into an access request or access review, or determining the types of requirements or security controls that are needed based on it. These are standard sort of practices that security organizations try to work with IT and other departments to do. The challenge has always just been is the fragmentation. And so you're dealing with, for example, a lot of applications and developers and use cases that have traditionally haven't been really something that IT has been comfortable with mandating, because it potentially can break the business, right? And it's areas where I don't necessarily know what it takes to, I'm scared of the blast radius of making a change to something that has been running in production for a very long time. Or I'm scared to make a change to these tokens because I don't know what's using them. I don't want to necessarily break those production workloads. And so those are sort of the headwinds against it. And I think organizations that look at high risk start putting practices in place to start formalizing the identity credentialing and the trust boundaries, and start deploying systems that better limit that blast radius, understand when things cross the trust boundary, why they're crossing the trust boundary. It starts with just sort of building that maturity model, and it often starts with your production teams, and then moves into dev, test, prod. It moves into then finally at the end a lot of the B2B type problem statements, which unfortunately ends up being sort of lower on the priority list, but increasingly is a significant challenge to protect your supply chain, whether it's software supply chain or your B2B supply chain.
So, Ryan, in your maturity model, I believe use of OAuth starts. It begins in, like, I believe your 1 rating. 0 is like you're just sharing credentials on your on Slack or something, and at 1 you start to maybe use tokens and credentials. But really, you reserved some of the more advanced features of OAuth for level 4, which was like the visionary companies. And so I want to drill down a little bit on dynamic client registration, because what I was trying to sort of finesse out is that the people who are sometimes making access decisions at a business level might not be the developers who are actually, need the client credentials. And there needs to be some way maybe to delegate or bridge these two groups, business users versus the engineering operations team. And one of the solutions that we've seen work in the industry is to move to dynamic client registration, where we're not trying to actually create credentials, but we're authorizing developers to create credentials. And those developers are creating asymmetric credentials instead of symmetric credentials. So my question is around dynamic client registration. I don't really see, outside of something like an open banking, UK open banking or Brazil open banking, I don't see a lot of like adoption of dynamic client registration in the wild. I'm curious, are you seeing more of it? And do you think this is a direction maybe what we need to go?
I similarly haven't seen a ton of adoption of dynamic client registration in particular. I think it is something that I'm curious to hear Carl's opinion. I think it's something that could, empower that sort of delegation to which he was referring earlier. But I think one of the things that we actually see a lot of the time is sort of the focus for a lot of businesses is unlock the business use case first, do what it takes. And then there becomes a question of, all right, well, when do I formalize this connection, right? So if I'm POCing some new process or some new software, then I'm not going to invest as much in sort of the best practices if that's more effort, and I don't even know that this is something that's going to become part of my production use case for me. So maybe I try to move with a little bit more agility. But at what point do I actually revisit and invest more in sort of the quote unquote right solution? But I do see something like dynamic client registration as something that could empower that sort of delegation.
I think
more amongst.
Yeah, I think we're kind of double clicking on the next level below is I think it's a partial problem statement. So dynamic client registration, I don't think gives the enterprise what it's really looking for. And the problem statement is that I have thousands of authorization servers. I have to manage every authorization server. I have to know what every client is. I have to then determine which scopes or permissions or grants. I have to make sure those credentials are managed. I have to do that across everything. And I have to have visibility over that. And there's missing standards for even to do that. So just creating a client, for example, doesn't necessarily grant it authorization to do anything. I have to maybe use a proprietary authorization policy, XYZ, whatever the thing is, to grant the principal the right permissions to do the right things. I need to then make sure that the union between the OAuth world and the fine grained model actually makes sense for what I'm actually trying to do from a least privileged perspective. And from a credentialing perspective, often I need to be able to have the infrastructure in place to manage that. A shared credential, I can throw that into a shared vault and put processes around the vault. If I move to asymmetric key pairs, that may be possible, but now I need to start managing key rotation and have a processes to audit those and rotate those. Definitely a different maturity model to how about doing that. And all this just goes against is like, I think that this kind of is why we're starting to see what happened in the world with SSO for user authentication starting to pick up for workload authentication, which is we confederate. Instead of trying to manage all of these models inside and credentials inside of all these applications, why can't I bring in an assertion of client authentication into the SaaS or into the application and have it trust the issuer? And so this is sort of, standards like Whimsy. There's even ways to do it with JWT-based authentication. But in general, it's trying to move more towards a trust anchor that you can put central policies around and then federate through that versus trying to manage individual client or credential enrollment, credential rotation, credential management, and then solving the permission management and revocation challenges across every single identity store or SaaS application. So I don't think dynamic client registration has been too successful in the broad because just different usage models across SaaS. A lot of SaaSes have catalogs of integrations. You don't build your own OAuth client to connect two SaaS apps. You just go to their catalog and say, I want to use this integration. So you need a lot for the experience side of it all. You don't want registration being done. You want to sort of reuse existing, and it starts getting into these challenges of like, why are we not able to bring a graph of authorized applications to an app instead of trying to recreate it all the time? I think that's where the direction is being headed with trying to move to more federated architecture for that.
Yeah. And I wanted to make a pitch for software statements because I think one of the challenges around dynamic client registration is, fine, you have client credentials. I see this is your public key. I don't need any trust.
Yep.
But to give you access, to give you maybe certain scopes or certain other claims in your access token, I need to trust you. So during client registration, if the client can present maybe a software statement that says, like a token that says,
Mhm.
you've been vetted legally, and we are authorizing you to do these things, and then the developer can take that and then register their client credentials. So I love that idea. I've seen it work in open banking, but I don't see it anywhere else really other than open banking.
I think the challenge with what you just mentioned is that it's a point in time. And when we start talking about non-human identity, the direction is really needing software continues to get updated, right? You're deploying software constantly. How do I know, for example, this NPM package is the right package? So the software that's deployed that has access to the credential to act on behalf of a user or a workload or a thing, you need eventually to start providing more continuous evidence of the runtime, of the software stack, of what you're running, be able to pass that. So it follows, again, the same kind of trajectory of where user and continuous authentication goes, which is a software statement of a point in time snapshot is maybe useful for some level, but software changes and it's not static. And we need to manage that as part of the trust model, which is why moving that trust decision into a trust broker that's closer to the enterprise and not pushing that complexity into every single application is partly why, again, I keep advocating like directionality. We need to shift the architecture to solve this.
Right. And Ryan, one of the other things is credentials themselves should rotate. We want people to change passwords. And,
Yeah.
when we first started with web, we used to issue like 10-year certs for like web servers. And that time frame has come down. But client credentials have the same issue. They need to be rotated. And this is another challenge. But any thoughts about how does Natoma maybe help or facilitate, or an infrastructure like Natoma facilitate the client credential rotation itself?
You're 100% correct. Credential rotation is kind of the way I like to think of it is it's the thing that everyone knows that they need to do and probably knows that they need to do more frequently than they actually do it. It's a little bit like eating your vegetables. Everyone knows you should do
I'm
it,
a
but
vegetarian, so that's
if
easy for me.
someone's actually watching it, are you eating enough vegetables? I think we probably, for many of us, the answer is no. But when I talk to organizations, it's because it comes down to a root cause of poor visibility around how credentials are being used. So I've got a credential that hasn't been rotated in a couple of years. And we hear this example all the time. It's like, well, I don't really know where this is being used based on its naming status, like naming conventions they're used. I think it's used with System A or Service A. So I'm going to go update it and make sure it's updated in that one place. And then great, I rotate it. And now I've just broken 5 other services, which were using the same credential to power some sort of integration or some sort of software automation. And so that's where Natoma can really help understand both what non-human identities exist, and importantly, to the second piece there, where and how they're being used. In an ideal world, you can simplify things by, separating out non-human identity a little bit more. So the same credential isn't being used multiple different systems. In reality, a lot of organizations don't follow that because maybe they're hacking together something and each credential is going to cost an additional license for them. And so they want to reduce costs and consolidate it down to a single service account user, let's say. And then they lose sight of where that's being used and they're unable to rotate it without fear of causing an outage. So where Natoma can really come in and help is say, these are all of your non-human identities and the credentials that are associated with them and when they were last rotated. In addition, since that time, these are the clients, let's say, that we've seen where using this particular identity, so that when it comes time to rotate that again, which could be just a number of days, or maybe someone that we saw had access to that credential left your organization, you now need to update clients A, B, C, and D to avoid an outage. So bringing that visibility and that context to help you act confidently is ideally how you get to a position where you can confidently eat more vegetables.
There's a change management, right? Anyone who's, deployed software or done anything wrong, there's the change management problem, which is how do I make sure the blast radius is what I think it is? And so everybody starts with a visibility period where you monitor usage, you try to understand what are the impacts of it, and then you try to orchestrate the change in a way that minimize blowback of it. And tools like Natoma and things like that help that orchestration process, both from a visibility, both from an attribution, and both potentially as a rollout perspective. Is you're helping that change management overhead of maturing your non-human identity security. And so that's where the gaps are today, is really, I think, having a tool like Natoma be able to help manage change management. Because if you're left to your own devices of filing Jira tickets and flowing those across the organization, hoping that you're going to get a security outcome, I think that's sort of the probably a non-ideal outcome.
So I don't normally take questions because I try and pay attention to you guys. But Rohit, one of our guests who was on in the past, and he'll be on again, I think December 12th, asked a question that I was going to ask anyway, so I'm just going to post it. But potentially, we're going to see AI agents acting on our behalf. And I think Rohit's existential question here is, are those agents going to impersonate us? Are we going to share our passwords with them? Or are we going to see, oh, this employee at this company has several agents that have their own identity that might be acting on their behalf? And how does that actually change the sort of the challenge? Ryan, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, happy to. I saw the question in the chat earlier from Rohit, and I think it's a really important one, because to me, this is one of the reasons why non-human identity management is becoming a more and more critical problem to solve. When you think about an AI agent that you want to give permissions to take some action on your behalf, in a consumer context, maybe that's booking a flight or making a dinner reservation or something like that, you're giving that agent access to your permissions, to permissions that you already have, and you're granting it to do access to do something on your behalf.
Right. Will this flow up into the enterprise, though? Is the question.
Yeah, I think the same thing is true in the enterprise. I was just taking the consumer. You might want to do the exact same thing, whether in an enterprise technology, like giving it access to an entire Confluence space to kind of read and digest and summarize that for you, or having it manage that content a little bit more holistically. And when you're in that situation, you're giving it permissions, and you're giving it, obviously, as an AI agent, the ability to act in a way that you wouldn't as a human. So I view that as falling squarely into the realm of non-human identity management. Whether or not you're creating a separate identity for that, you're giving that AI agent access to a lot of sensitive permissions, and giving it the ability, and it has the ability to behave in a non-human manner. So whether or not we separate those agents out as different identities, or they just sort of assume our own permissions, I view this as kind of a very important thing for organizations and enterprises to monitor, because they start to lose a bit of control, or they want to have control, or at least visibility into how those agents are operating or are able to operate.
Yeah, and Carl, if you want to comment on that or not, I have another question.
I'll add to what Ryan's saying, because I think he's hinting on a lot of things of where it's headed. So, like many things, we're starting this off with working with the way the world works today. So folks are going to be, hosting headless browsers, taking session cookies from interactive signed-in sessions and trying to replay them and reuse them to try to light up use cases. We're very early in sort of the development model of how these things go, and what you see end up happening is stuff that works, that lights up experiences, that gets adoption, ends up sort of wagging the dog as far as where the problem statements go, and what lays behind is sort of the legacy of all the security challenges. And then we need to build the standards, drive awareness on sort of how it should be done. And I think that's kind of where we're at on this journey, where from an agent perspective, you need to build on a lot of mature concepts. You need attestation, you need attribution, you need to know the identity of not just the user, but of the software and the agent, and be able to put a trust model in place so that I can only trust this agent that has this software running on this hardware and for this amount of time to act on me and on behalf of me for this constrained way. These are pretty hard concepts to get end to end, because it's high maturity of a lot of concepts coming together that's just not there today. I mean, we're still struggling with on behalf of in OAuth, right? Where it has massive adoption, but from the security perspective, we still haven't even seen, federation models of OAuth that have been possible for a decade. So part of this is sort of setting the way the world should work, then working backwards to the way the world is, and helping draw awareness based on the types of operations that are being done. Maybe you're willing to adopt some suboptimal models for agents that don't have write action or immutable mutations, right? So some read-only scenarios. You have problems with commingling of data, right? Which is if I need to index data across a set of data stores, and I need to filter that by what's the user entitled to see. How do I enforce that user row level granularity of read across these problem statements? Do I, opt as the user and send every request to the downstream resource and hit all your rate limits and have poor performance, or do I cache stuff and start then having to duplicate authorization models? I mean, this is what we're going to see with agents. It's like a lot of these challenges are sort of dealing with distributed computing problem statements, distributed authorization concepts, lack of sort of end-to-end standards around bringing this graph of on behalf of a tested identity acting on behalf of something else in a constrained way with attribution. And we're knocking those problems down. I mean, there's like the Whimsy groups is starting to solve some of this for workload identity stuff. We're knocking some of this down with some of the stuff that's going to happen in OAuth. But back to that maturity model, just putting all that stuff in a vault, having centralization of it, and delegating access to the vault or wallet or credential vaults or whatever you're doing gives you at least some level of control that you didn't have versus sprinkling everything through. So I think that's kind of where agents are today, is that it's sort of wild west. You can draw on some of the experience of what we've done through DevOps and sort of ephemeral infrastructure, pull those concepts forward, start investing in sort of the next generation of standards that are going to be needed to build that trust model that I've just described. But it's going to be a journey, and unfortunately, we're going to move faster in adoption than the maturity model of the security standards are going to exist, and that's how it's, I think, always been.
I'm not able to get to the one question I was hoping to last, which is about identifiers, because identity includes the identifier plus the proof, the credential, and potentially plus authorizations. But where I see we're hitting 41 minutes, so maybe we'll pick this conversation up on the LinkedIn afterwards. I also showed there was some chat on this episode, so we can also go to the LinkedIn page after that and answer some of the other chat we didn't get a chance to get to. But I try and keep these things roughly on time. So Ryan, before we call it, any last thoughts or calls to action about Natoma?
Yeah. Hopefully after this session, you understand the importance and the urgency of this problem if you didn't already beforehand. If you're interested in learning more and more about non-human identity management and how Natoma might be able to help you out, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can go to our website at natoma.id. We'll set you up with a free demo and have a conversation around it. Excited to learn more about how organizations are facing up with this problem today. So thanks, Mike.
Okay. Carl, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think as everything, start making the request to your vendors, sort of start making them understand the pain. A lot of this stuff comes because you're the customer, and the vendors listen to the customers. Ryan's the product manager. He listens to his customers. Everybody has product managers that are trying to listen to what their customers need. And as we mature, we need to make it clear on what is the requirements and what is the demand side of the problem statement, so we can use that to fund development of where we need to go. So that's my only ask right now, is that, like, as you guys all have programs and start learning and maturing, start making the ask to the vendors on what do you expect to be better, so that we can use that to kind of push the industry forward.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank the guests for being with us. Thanks to the audience. One request to the audience, if you could go to the LinkedIn page. I know it's hard to find these LinkedIn company pages, but there's a LinkedIn company page for Identity Office Hours. Please hit follow on that. We get special magic powers from LinkedIn when we get to 1,000 followers. We're almost there. And we'll see you on Thursday. We have a live stream with Observe ID, hearing what they're up to. So with that, see you next time, and thanks everyone.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
Carl.
you. Well, awesome.